Welcome back, everybody, to a special episode of The Hopeful Majority. Yesterday, President Trump experienced an assassination attempt on his life in a rally in Butler, Pennsylvania. Today, we're recording this Sunday, 12:03 p.m. Pacific time. I'm timestamping because the news is constantly evolving. And look, I wanted to wait a little bit, 14 hours, to put out this episode. And the reason is because as a young person, who's 25 years old, living in this democracy, somebody that loves their country deeply, I felt a deep sense of emotion. I felt anger. I felt sadness. I felt despair. I felt a sense of defeatism because this is some of our worst fears coming to life. This idea that we were living on the knife's edge of division and we're seeing things actually result in real world consequence. So I wanted to wait. And I wanted to understand. I wanted to process. And this show is an important one because I think that this show contains, and the episode that you're about to listen to contains information that you won't hear elsewhere. Because while everybody else is pushing their agenda, we are at this moment focused on how we as a country call on the better angels of our nature to actually bridge our differences, because bringing our country together must be priority number one. Let's get into the show. The assassination attempt yesterday on President Trump's life, I am relieved that it was widely condemned. We cannot have political violence of any sort in this country. And I've got a lot of thoughts on this, and they're still bouncing around my head. And I might not be fully coherent through this. And so I want to, at the top, outline my three claims, three thoughts, three takeaways that I want you to leave here with. Because remember, the hopeful majority, this show, is about people that are not moderates or squishy liberals or centrists or what conservatives. This is a show about people that have very strong beliefs, but most importantly, they believe in the power of words over the power of gun. This is a show about people in this country, what I think are relatively silent, that believe in being open-minded, listening to each other, to building relationships. This is a show for you and I, the person that feels silenced because the loudest voices on the extremes push us out. So with that idea in mind, there's three takeaways that we have to understand from yesterday. Takeaway number one is that very unfortunately and sadly, this did not surprise me because this instance exists in a broader context of the spiraling toxic polarization in our society. Point number two is that history tells us that violence begets violence. This, unfortunately, I do not think will be the end. I think we'll see more political violence in our country. Not necessarily the profile that we saw yesterday, but violence in our streets, discord, civil unrest, people like you and I being put at danger because we can't figure out our differences. And takeaway number three is that bringing our country back together must be priority number one, period, full stop. There is no more caveats to that statement. Let's go through each of these. Takeaway number one. This, unfortunately, did not surprise me. The assassination attempt on President Trump's life did not surprise me because, unfortunately, this is existing in a context of deep toxic polarization where we understand that we as a society are spiraling towards one outcome. And the fact is that we're forgetting that we actually have agency to get out of that death spiral, but we're going to talk about that later in the show. We have laid the foundation in our society for political violence to be rampant, relevant, and everywhere because we have laid the foundation for this idea that the other side represents an existential threat to my existence. People on the right, the MAGA supporters that believe in President Trump deeply, have been led to believe that liberals in this country threaten their very existence of life and are pulling their country literally out of their hands. And liberals in this country that are, especially in the far left, that deeply believe in the progressive ideal, believe that President Trump and his quote-unquote, as they would say, MAGA goons represent an existential threat to their democracy and their country's at risk. Take yourself outside of the American context. If I had you analyze that situation where you have two factions that believe that they're fundamentally at existential risk of each other, what do you think happens in one of the most divisive political moments in our history leading up to an election? I think that we live at a moment where we are underestimating how close we are to letting the vocal extremes tear us apart. And here's the most important thing to understand at this moment. The most understated point of this political moment where people claim that we live at one of the most divided times in American history, begets the fact that the average everyday American like you and I are actually not that divided. It is the vocal extremes across the political spectrum that hold the microphone and hold us hostage. I was last week speaking to 70 high school students from across the country in Oklahoma State Capitol, and the common sentiment I heard from these young people is not that we don't want to have the conversation. It's not that we don't want to listen to our neighbor. It's not that we want to engage in conversation or understanding. It's that the loudest people hog the microphone and silence us. The problem in the United States right now, the reason why we're seeing more of this and will continue to see more violence in our country, is because we've let the loudest opinion makers dominate the news cycle and control the temperature of our country. It's like letting your crazy uncle set the thermostat in your house and then you relinquishing all control of that thermostat. It's got to stop. This understanding of existential threat, this rhetoric that we see from our leaders, we have to call it out. Because yes, you might believe that the other side is fundamentally wrong in some of their assumptions. But I think it's a long leap to say that just because you disagree with their substance means that they're evil and that they've got to be extinguished. History's riddled with societies. History's riddled with historical figures, with moments where people felt such existential threat from the other that they resorted to the most heinous acts. And when you look back, you say, well, that's wrong. You can't have violence. You can't act this way. But hindsight is 2020. We're living in that moment right now. We've got two sides that are barreling towards the existential crisis, and they believe that they represent and threaten each other, and we have to change that. And the most important thing to recognize in this moment, the tragedy of this moment, is that the average everyday American like you and I, we want three basic things. We want to live in a world where people believe in safety and security. We want to live in a world where our kids do better than us. We want to be able to live in a world in which we are heard. It's not a long list. This moment calls for the better angels of our nature, but more importantly, calls for the everyday average person like you and I to step up and be vocal, because we cannot let the vocal minorities across the political spectrum dominate the conversation and push forward this outrage industrial complex. Point number two, we just said that violence exists in a context, that we've laid a foundation where our civic culture is collapsing and leading to continuing heinous acts of violence from the highest profiles to the lowest profiles in our community. Well, here's point number two. History tells us that violence begets more violence. Let me just detail for you from 2019 to 2024. Summer of 2020, we saw the Black Lives Matter protests across the country. We saw riots across the country. We saw violence. We saw significant property damage. We saw people getting hurt. We then proceeded in our political environment. We saw an attempt and a threat to Brett Kavanaugh's life, Justice Kavanaugh. We saw the January 6th insurrection, which some might call the most brazen attack on American democracy on the left, which cost not only significant damage, but one person died, police officers were at risk, and most importantly, people felt like the very seat of our democracy was at risk. We saw a kidnapping plot from Gretchen Whitmer. We saw the assassination attempt yesterday of President Trump. What we have to understand is that at this moment, we've set up a world in which violence is the normalization and the way in which we express our thoughts. And you know what history tells us? That only takes us one place. Take a step back. Imagine I told you that there's a society in the span of 4 years, they had some of the largest scale protests that they've seen in society. They've had assassination attempts. They've had kidnapping attempts. They've had violence across the streets. And you as an objective observer is now going to stand and say, yeah, this is, of course, what's going to happen. Now, I can already hear somebody saying, how dare you compare and put January 6th in the same sentence as President Trump's assassination attempt, in the same sentence as the Black Lives Matter protest, in the same sentence as Supreme Court Justice Kavanaugh's attempted plot, as Governor Whitmer's kidnapping attempt. I'm tired of this argument of false equivalencies. I'm tired of this argument that we have to justify our instance of violence because it's okay at the contempt and execution of the other side. If we live at a moment where we justify that our violence is okay, but theirs isn't, it only goes to one spot, because here's the fact. You're not going to convince the other side that you're okay, but they're wrong. That's like being at your Thanksgiving dinner and trying to tell your crazy uncle that he's crazy. But you're absolutely not. You think that's going to work out? Violence begets violence. This shooter does not represent one side of the political aisle that you disagree with. This shooter was an individual on their instance acting within a context of deep tribalism, polarization. We're going to hear more information about them. But we have to stop at the water's edge and recognize that if we take this instance, and I'm already seeing this from my friends on the conservative side, and they say, those people are the reason why this happened. That rhetoric is the reason why this happened. Well, let me tell you something. Whether you like it or not, that's what your liberal brothers and sisters are doing after January 6th. And you weren't okay with that then. I know that me saying this is going to get 0 points from everybody. But I also know that I think most of the people listening to the show, the hopeful majority, the people that are relatively silent, and the people that honestly just want to be normal, functioning human beings and live in a society that respects them, those people, I think, believe this. And that's our bet. That's how we elevate the hopeful majority and arrest ourselves out of this toxic polarization spiral we're in, where the vocal extremes across the political spectrum control the microphone at the expense of your safety, your security, your belief in democracy. Resist the temptation today to blame the other side for this. Instead, blame the system, the process, the normalization of toxic polarization that has enabled us to say that the other side is so evil that they deserve to be extinguished. You know what that harkens back to? The greatest tragedies of our time. And remember, hindsight is 20/20. When you're living in it, it's impossible to name it. I'll name it for you. It's time to hit the eject button. It's time to hit the eject button out of the outrage industrial complex. Those pundits, those opinion makers out there jumping on their microphone saying, hey, this is my take. It's because they want your influence, they want your attention, and they care about how long you watch their video. That's what they care about. I'm sure they care about their worldview. But here's what I would say. I have worldviews. I don't think they're more important than the United States of America. How many of them are going to say that? All of them, because they don't want you to believe it. Point number 3, last point. Bringing our country together must be priority number 1, full stop, no caveats. Manu, 7 years ago, 2017, we were doing this work on UC Berkeley's campus, right? As college students. I was a pre-med student, if you remember. We started this work. I had no interest in a lot of this work. And I remember people used to come up to us and say, all you're doing is bring a bunch of people to talk to each other. This is some kumbaya broccoli nonsense. And, we would come up with our intellectual arguments. We said, no. After yesterday, no. We're building the foundation for you and I to have a voice so that we can listen to each other, hear each other, understand that you've got to pick the power of the word over the power of the gun, because we live in a deliberative democracy. We live in the most ambitious democratic experiment in the history of humanity. I didn't say greatest. I didn't say worst. Ambitious. It's this idea that when you aspire for building a society of 350 million people that all look differently than each other with different ideas, different backgrounds, heavily armed, trying to make it work? That's special. It's why Thomas Paine said in 1775 that the United States is humanity's last best hope. Well, why did he say that? He said that because if you look at the history of humanity, it is not one of peace but war. It's one of violence. It's one of understanding that we give in to the existential threat that the other group poses and pick up the gun as opposed to go to the town square. Bring our country together must be priority number 1, because I think that whether you believe in criminal justice reform, free speech, abortion, and pro-choice, whether you believe in the sanctity of the womb, whether you believe in closing down the southern border, whether you believe in more immigration, none of those debates, none of those conversations happen in a world in which we are taking out our political opponents because we cannot have the disagreement. And here's the most important thing. Conflict is good. The question is what type of conflict. Healthy conflict is a necessity. That's the engine of democracy. As that saying goes, democracy dies in disagreement. Of course not. The question is, how do we have that disagreement? You have agency in this process. Everybody right now, all those opinion makers and pundits saying, we got to bring the country together. Well, put your money where your mouth is. I'll give you one last take. I never do this on the show, but I think that this is a safe space for bad ideas, right? So here's my take. I was thinking about this. Yesterday, I was picking up my good friend from the airport. He had just come from London. I don't think I will forget where I was the moment I heard about the assassination attempt, because it was so visceral. It was like my worst fears coming to life. I had this deep pit in my stomach. So I'll tell you, I was sitting there, right? And 5 to 10 minutes later, people started also jumping on, well, what's the implication of the election? What's going to happen here? What's going to happen there? And my thought was, President Biden actually has a significant opportunity right now. It's one take. In 55 episodes of the show, I've never shared a take. Here's my take. I think what should happen is that President Biden should announce that he's no longer running for re-election, give it off to whoever he wants to on the Democratic side, and then say that I will commit for the next 4 months to not being a Democratic president or a Republican president, but an American president. And I'm going to spend the next 4 months laying the foundation for the most ambitious bridge building project in American history. I'm going to spend the next 4 months bringing this country back together priority number one. As he says, restore the soul of our nation. You cannot do that when you're running for re-election. I think what should happen is that the presidency, the office, has the opportunity to radically invest in this country at this moment. There's always a silver lining out of tragedy. The question is, how bad do we want to find that silver lining? We started this show because we believe, like you, that the American experiment is special. It's got its flaws. It's got its challenges. What special thing does it? The question is that with great ambition comes a prospect that most likely it's not going to work out. If you're a betting person and you saw this 250-year span of history, civilization called the United States of America, and you put it in the context of humanity, your betting odds to bet against that place, this thing called the United States, you're getting great odds. Nobody takes that bet. This place is not supposed to succeed. No way. No chance. But it's our best hope. Because there's few moments in American history, global history, civilizational history, where people have been able to choose the power of the word over the power of the gun. And yesterday we failed. But tomorrow we have the chance and opportunity to invest in each other, because we have to remember that not everybody's divided. It's the loud extremes dominating the microphone. Every Monday, if you're new and joining this, and you probably are, because the SEO, unfortunately, at this moment on news terms is really high. We produce episodes and conversations. We talk to presidential candidates. We talk to intellectuals, authors, random people like me. And we've had a lot of good conversations and discussions. And I think you'll appreciate it, because here we talk about something that nobody else talks about. That's how you pull this country back from the brink. I'll see you next week.